California's Gold is seen statewide on California Public Television. This series is endorsed by the California Teachers Association, the California School Boards Association, and the California Library Association.
California's Gold is brought to you by Ford, with a world of new ideas that make being out on the road more fun and more economical. Like Sync, the hands-free communication and entertainment system from Microsoft. It lets you order up practically anything you want to hear just by asking. And turn-by-turn navigation gets you exactly where you want to go. Ford hopes you enjoy traveling through California with Huell, perhaps in one of our remarkable new products.
Well, hello everybody, I'm Huell, and you know, when we study California history, there are lots of names that are familiar. They kind of jump right out at us off the pages of the history book. We know them, they're household words. These men and women made major contributions to the California story over the years. But you know what? When you study California history, there are also lots of other names that aren't as familiar. In fact, they're very obscure if we know them or recognize them at all. And yet these men and women made important contributions to the California story as well. And that's what this adventure is all about, because we're getting ready to study the story of one of those obscure individuals whose contributions were very much a part of Hollywood history. We're here at the Hollywood Bowl. Now, this fellow was definitely not a Hollywood movie star. He was never on the big screen. But his contributions to the history of Hollywood continue today to be important and very much a part of California's gold. Okay, our adventure begins. We have left the bowl itself. It's right up there. Now we've come out to the entrance of the bowl, this beautifully landscaped driveway with the palm trees, and then you look right over here. Here is Highland Avenue, busy Highland Avenue, where the major traffic flow goes in front of the entrance to the bowl. Interstate 101 is right up there. There's a lot of traffic goes by this area every single day. And this is where we have come to start our adventure. Not the bowl itself, but in front of the bowl. And here's what we're interested in right over there. Well, we're interested in you too, Arvin, because you're going to tell us the story. Right. Introduce yourself to everybody.
I'm Arvin Minocha. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Bowl, and I'm here to tell you about what's behind us.
Yeah, because this is, you know, this is one of those things that, what do you predict in a year? Hundreds of thousands of people drive by here either on Highland or coming up to the bowl.
Oh yeah, we get over 1 million people here for concerts every year, and then all the hundreds of thousands of people that drive by.
So we're talking about millions of people drive by this every year.
Absolutely.
And probably don't even see it, or if they see it, they don't really know the history behind it. That's why you're here.
All right.
What is this called, and what's the history behind it?
This is the Muse of Music. This is a wonderful sculpture and fountain that was designed and built in 1940 by George Stanley.
George Stanley. Now there's the name that hopefully everybody is going to be familiar with by the end of this adventure.
All right.
Who was George Stanley?
George Stanley was a wonderful sculptor and artist who moved here from California at a very young age. He taught at Otis for many years.
That was a school of art.
Otis School of Design, yeah. And he also has sculpted many wonderful statues all around LA, including Sir Isaac Newton at the observatory, for example.
At the observatory. He also did a lot of private work in homes and gardens and things like that.
Absolutely.
But he did this in
1940.
Now, why did he do this in 1940? What's the purpose behind this? Do you call it a fountain or a piece of sculpture or both?
It's both. I mean, it is sculpture and it has a fountain element to it, and it was placed here really to be the gateway to Hollywood. It has the Muse of Music at its very top, the muses of theater on this side, and around the corner, the muse of dance.
So you've got music, theater, dance,
Yes.
and this was kind of the gateway to it all right here.
Absolutely.
Going up to the bowl.
Yeah, because this has been a place, the Bowl's been here since 1922 and has been a home for musicians, artists, dancers, actors. So this sculpture really told everybody who drove along Highland Avenue that behind this hill is a wonderful temple for music.
Was this a big deal when it was built? 1938 to 1940?
Absolutely. You know, this was a WPA project, and it's one of the largest WPA projects in California. So it was a very big deal at the time.
Okay, the reason I asked that, it was a big deal when it was built.
Yeah.
And it was a big deal for the first couple of decades of its existence.
Yeah.
But there's another chapter to this story that's not so pleasant.
That's true. You know, by the 80s, this statue had really fallen into great disrepair. The fountain had stopped working, the lighting had stopped working, and actually this whole area was grown over with trees and shrubbery and
this
bush.
whole area all the way down here. It was
Mostly at the top and around the corner, but many people wouldn't have even known as they drove by that behind all that shrubbery was a wonderful piece of art.
Well, you didn't know it at first when you came to work here.
When I drove up here, this place was not, the statue was not in very good shape, but it was pretty clear that we had an opportunity to rehab and do something about it.
And what was that opportunity? You did rehab the whole thing.
Yeah, well, we started with the shell itself, and we redid the bowl shell in 2004, and then it became pretty clear that the next project we had to take on was bringing this beautiful piece of art back to life.
Boy, I'm just looking at this statue right here. Look at this camera. It's so beautiful with the sun shining on it. It's held up so well over the years, but I bet it was dirty when you had to clean it, didn't you?
We had to clean it. We had to do some repair of the concrete and the granite. We had to do the systems, the mechanical and the electrical and the plumbing and all of that. It was all shut. Absolutely.
And we missed it. I don't know. I guess our invitation got lost in the mail, but you had a big rededication of this fountain, didn't you?
We had a wonderful ceremony in June.
And didn't George Stanley's son come to that?
George Stanley's son did come down. He and his wife and their children drove down from San Francisco, and it was so great to be able to unveil this work to the family because they had seen it fall into disrepair over the years, and they had always wanted to be able to show their grandkids what their father had done and what he had created here.
Yeah. Well, this is a major work right here in a major, you know, with all this traffic going by, lots of people see this every day, or at least drive by it, whether they see it consciously or not.
That's true.
It's here for a lot of people to see.
You know, a lot of people ask me after we rededicated it, you know, oh, you built a new fountain at the bowl. And these are people who've been coming here for decades. And I ought to tell people, actually, it's not new at all. It's always been there. You've been driving by it every Tuesday when you come to your concert. It's just that you hadn't been able to see it right. So now people can see it and appreciate it and really see the beauty of it. You know, Huell, it looks great now, but before we did the renovation, this whole area was covered by shrubbery and tall trees.
This had all grown up.
It had all grown up. You couldn't even see it. When you drove up, you wouldn't see any of this
And none of
granite.
this water was here because the fountain was dry.
The pools were emptied, the plumbing didn't work, so it was all dry and overgrown. And, you know, when you get here, you see something very sweet. George Stanley's name engraved into the granite with the date. In fact, it was a WPA project, and George Stanley's son told us when he came down for the dedication that when he was younger, he would take his young grandchildren and they'd drive down from San Francisco, and they would cut back some of the shrubbery to let their grandfather's name show through so people could see it. So it was very nice that his family was here when this whole thing was done because they really got to enjoy it once.
Well, it also showed how important this piece of sculpture was to George Stanley himself.
Absolutely. No, they're very proud of it. The family's very proud of this work, as they should be.
And as beautiful as it is right now, and you know, there's not a bad angle anywhere. Look at this, looking out over the Muse right there on the top. We aren't here at night, and you say that's when it really shines.
Yeah, at night it's stunning because it's all very tastefully lit in a very modern style.
So people, it's hard not to notice it at night.
Sure.
When it's lit up.
Absolutely. When you drive by Highland, or if you're coming out of a concert at the end of the night, I mean, it is a wonderful thing to see as you leave the Hollywood Bowl.
All right, we've had a nice tour. We've found out a little bit about George Stanley. There's more to this tour left, though, because You're throwing me a curve here, a surprise. We're getting ready to go inside and see a part of this sculpture that most people don't get to see. Can you tell from looking where we're going? It's gonna be hot in there. Oh, I gave it away. In there. Here we go. Wave at the camera. We have left our guides behind and look where we've come. Armando, we've hooked up with Armando and we're at the top, almost at the top of the fountain of the sculpture. And Armando, why have you brought us up here?
This is the entrance to our pit here.
To the pit. We're going down into the pit.
Right.
And Arvin has already told us very few people have ever been in the pit or wanted to go in the pit.
Yeah, it's actually pretty hot in there. So I don't think anybody really wants to go in there.
Okay, but you know us, we want to leave no stone unturned, so we're leaving the outside and going down into the pit. Okay, I've already come down the ladder. Armando's coming down right after me. Armando, we're in the fountain.
We're in the fountain.
What's down here? Can we get the tour?
Oh yeah, we got all our pumps, which...
Be careful, Cameron, coming through here. Oh, these are the pumps for the fountain.
Pumps for a fountain, and we got all of our controls for our lights.
Now, some of this looks like the original copper piping.
Yes, it is.
So some of it is original. This stuff right here is original.
Yes, it is.
Wow. Now that's the outside right up there.
That's the outside.
All right, now what's there's more? Boy, it is hot and humid down here.
It's good. And this is all our controls.
Now this is new.
Right, this is all new. This is all our controls to our pumps and our lights and fiber optic lighting that lights up the whole fountain.
And these were the original
Those were the original steps, yes.
So people were coming down here back in 1940 doing the same thing you're doing today.
Definitely.
Wonder if it was as hot and humid down here back then as it is today.
Well, I mean, temperature, fluctuates, so I'm sure it was just as hot before, yes.
It was hot.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, it's been a great tour, but I'm sweating a lot. We got to get back up.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for the tour. We're now going up and out the statue. We're leaving the pit. Boy, I thought it was hot out here before, but compared to being inside that fountain, this is nothing.
Well, you're one of very, very few people that have actually been inside that fountain. So.
Ever wanted to be inside that? Certainly ever knew there was an inside to the fountain.
Well, now you've been in it.
Now, you know what? Something else that we discovered doing this adventure, we can't find a picture of George Stanley. You've looked too, because you wanted some for the rededication of the fountain.
Yeah, no, we looked and we haven't been able to find one, but we luckily got to meet his family, so there was a little bit of him in there.
Yeah, but
sure.
why are there no pictures of? He was fairly well known in the time, wasn't he?
Well, maybe somebody will see this and send one in.
Well, that's not going to do any good for this show, but we can't find a picture of George Stanley, but we do see his work. It's called the
Muse of Music.
The Muse of Music. It's been here at the entrance of the world-famous Hollywood Bowl since 1940. The bowl is an icon. This work by George Stanley is an icon, a restored icon as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, congratulations for bringing it back to life.
Thank
now
you for
listen,
coming.
as much as beautiful as this muse is, this beautiful fountain is, there's another chapter to the George Stanley Hollywood, California story, one that is going to blow you away. Millions, billions of people know about this chapter. They just never connected it with George Stanley. So we're leaving. Let's get a shot here, Cameron. We're leaving the Muse and we're heading cross town for the second chapter in the George Stanley, California, Hollywood story. Get ready. You're going to be blown away. Okay, we have now left that beautiful fountain over in front of the Hollywood Bowl. We've come cross town here in Los Angeles. We're now in the library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences here on La Cienega Boulevard, and a beautiful library, a rich, full library. If you want to know something about motion pictures or film or any of that genre, come to this library. If they don't have it, it's not around. For example, when we walked in the door, here on the table, remember over at the Bowl we were talking about we couldn't find any pictures of George Stanley? Guess what? They have a whole table full of pictures of George Stanley. Let's see what George Stanley looks like. Here's a picture of George Stanley and his first wife and their little baby. Here's a picture of George Stanley teaching students at the Otis School, the art school that he taught at for so many years here in Los Angeles. Here's a picture of George Stanley with fellow students and faculty members at Otis. Then we hit the jackpot. Here's a picture of George Stanley standing over a model of his famous fountain at the entrance to the Hollywood Bowl. That's an amazing archival, historic picture of George standing there looking at that model. And then to make things even better, they even have a picture of George Stanley. Here he is dressed in white at the quarry where they were getting the stone for the fountain. These are amazing, amazing pictures that were just laying out here on the table waiting for us when we got to the library. But there's more. We did not come here expecting to find pictures of George Stanley. We came here, come on over here, Bruce. Introduce yourself to everybody.
I'm Bruce Davis with the Academy. I used to be the executive director, but now I'm a retired guy.
Well, you know your Oscar history, you know your motion picture history, and you know your George Stanley history. That's why you're here today to talk with us. Now, we've already, told you that we were over at the fountain at the Hollywood Bowl.
Good place to start.
That's seen by millions of people every year. Now we're here to talk with you at the Academy Library about something that is seen by billions, with a B, of people every year, that George Stanley is directly connected with. Now let's work up to it slowly. We've got a magazine from 1927.
Yes, we do. This is in fact the only edition of this magazine that was ever published. It says #1 very optimistically, but there was never a #2. But what it shows you is kind of the logo that they developed. The Academy was a brand new organization in 1927, and they said we need sort of a symbol for the organization. They weren't looking at for a prize at that point because they hadn't decided to give
just a symbol.
They just wanted a symbol.
And so they came up with what looks suspiciously like an Oscar, but it wasn't.
It's a new gentleman with a very large sword, thank goodness. And he represents a knight who was supposed. I know he didn't bring his helmet or his hauberk today, but he's supposed to defend the art of the motion picture against attacks, which were quite frequent in those days.
Okay, that was on the cover of a magazine put out by the Academy in 1927.
Right.
Now let's go forward to 1929. The first Academy Awards were given out in 1929.
Yes, they were.
In order to give out Academy Awards, they had to come up with the literal Academy Award itself, and that's where this fella comes in. And since we know what George Stanley looks like, we know this isn't George Stanley. Who is this?
That's Cedric Gibbons, a very smooth-looking character. He was the head of the art department at MGM for many years, and quite a character. Married 2 very beautiful actresses, not at the same time, but
well, this is Hollywood.
It is Hollywood, and he was quite an aficionado of art and whatnot. He knew what the new trends were. He knew, in fact, that this, which he had sort of produced, meaning he had somebody at his art department draw it up, was not quite what you wanted for an award. And they talked about a medallion of some kind, like an Olympic medal. They talked about a big gold cup you could give people. And finally somebody said, why don't we try to make that into a three-dimensional form?
A statue.
A statue.
And
Let's give
that's
people
where
a little
George
statue.
Stanley came in. What did this fella, Cedric, contacted his friend, the sculptor, George Stanley?
Well, I don't think they were friends at that time. George was a kid. This was one of the first things that he did. The Hollywood Bowl was later.
Yeah.
But he was 25, and Los Angeles was not a hotbed of sculptural activity in 1927, 28 when they started talking about this. There weren't a lot of sculptors around, but Mr. Stanley, the kid, had just had a show at the Los Angeles Museum of Art. It was very well reviewed. The guy he did know was a fellow named Méliès, who was the critic from the Los Angeles Times, who had given Mr. Stanley a rave review.
So they hooked him up.
So they hooked him up, right. And so he brought the young man in and showed him this, I'm sure, but that isn't quite what I want. I'd like something a little smoother, a little more streamlined. We don't know exactly how the process worked.
But the bottom line is George Stanley ended up sculpting the
This guy.
Oscar.
He is the fellow who sculpted the Oscar. I think you'd have to say between them they designed it, but he executed it.
Now let's you're out of sequence here.
All right.
Here's the first thing we wanted to look at, because this is a piece of history itself, and this could have been sculpted. This is kind of a rough sculpture that could have been done by George.
They had arrived at the mold by this time, and this is one of the first test castings. And you can see it's all rough. It hasn't been smoothed off. You can see the mold lines here. It certainly hasn't been polished. It hasn't been covered with 5 different precious metals.
This was kind of a test.
This was a test.
Made.
Is it going to work? Does it look good all by itself? Yeah, it looks great, as a matter of fact.
All right, let's pull out the first one. Now, this is the first thing they came up with was this Oscar right here.
Well, for the first few years, they had a lower, this is a marble base. And
oh boy, it's heavy.
It is heavy. It's quite heavy because.
And this is an Oscar actually won by Cedric himself.
Mr. Gibbons went on to win 11 Oscars. So after he designed it, he started collecting them. In those days, or for most of that period, the Oscar went to the head of the art department. So
now pick up the other one. I'm going to hold this
right.
one. There's a difference in the Oscars over the years. This is the only difference.
It's
really
just
the base.
Is the base? Yeah. There have been 2 different molds, but the mold popped out the same guy. But they did raise the base a little bit during the war. Although there was a period during the war, during metal shortages, where all the Oscars they gave out were plaster. Wow. But we let people redeem those for a metal one.
So the point is, through all of this wonderful Hollywood history that you've shared with us, George Stanley is the guy who sculpted the Oscar.
The Oscar. And
the one and only Oscar, the only Oscar that's been given out since 1927, because even though the base has changed, the Oscar itself has remained the same all these years.
This has been described, not by us, but by an actual art museum, as the most famous piece of 20th century sculpture, the best known piece of 20th century sculpture. And it was made by a man whose name is very little known, even in his hometown.
See, that's what this story is really all about, is that George Stanley is not a household word, even in Hollywood, even in the motion picture industry, and yet he did amazing work that's all over this city, and he sculpted the Oscar.
And it continues to look great. I mean, it doesn't look like something out of the past. It looks modern and streamlined, and maybe that's why they call it streamlined modern. But anyway, he did a terrific job.
Well, I tell you what, we've got this wonderful picture of him right here with the Oscar. It couldn't get any better than this, finding a picture of George Stanley at home with an Oscar that he sculpted himself. How many billion people do you think there are in the world who know Oscar? The word Oscar meaning this thing right here.
It's hard to say. I'm always skeptical. People say, oh, 2 billion people see the show. I don't think 1 billion people have ever watched any one television show. But certainly, as you say, they know this thing. We have never had a group come through the Academy from any country in the world. When you get this guy out, they say, Oscar. They know who that is, and they know it, and they know how to hold it. It feels good to hold an Oscar. You grab him there. Notice it's perfectly balanced.
This is as close to an Oscar as we're ever going to get right here.
I'm thinking you're right. Yeah.
It does feel good. And you know what? It feels good to give George Stanley his due. You told me a great story about George Stanley and his wife attending the first Oscar ceremony back in 1929.
Well, he was invited. It wasn't a big deal back then because there wasn't any history. No, they'd never done one before. But they did give him his own copy of the statuette. I noticed they didn't give him a base, but and then they invited him to the ceremony. And at one point, they had him stand up, and the guy with the light couldn't find him, and he was kind of at the end of the table, and his wife told us, well, we were sort of behind palm trees, so people were looking around, but nobody ever saw him, so he just sat back down.
Well, he's been one of these figures in Hollywood and California history that's been unknown for all these years. Hopefully this program will help put the spotlight where it belongs on George Stanley and all the good work he did over the years, including, boy, it does feel good to hold it like this, including the Oscar. George Stanley, his sculpture, his history, his body of work, all of it, very much a part of California's gold. Hello, everybody. I'm Huell Hauser, and from a beautiful fountain to the Oscar, it's all about history. It's all about unsung heroes. And George Stanley is definitely a fine example of California's gold. Now, if you'd like to go on this Hollywood adventure again or share it with family or friends, of course, it's available on DVD. All you have to do is call 1-800-266-5727, and we'll be glad to send it to you right away.
Ford and the Ford dealers are proud to have brought you California's gold. Discover the new ideas we're developing to make being out on the road more enjoyable and more economical. Like EcoBoost, the turbocharged engine technology that gives you the power of a larger engine with surprising gas mileage. Ford is committed to making your traveling fun, economical, and environmentally responsible.